Welcome to the State of the Nation. My name's Mike Sham, I'm your host for the day, and rejoining us is Dr. Frans Cronje. Frans, it's so lovely to have you back here on the State of the Nation, Social Research Foundation. You're the guy.
Yeah, Michael, nice to see you again.
It is.
Long history together.
Well, it is, eh?
You know, from those big live events.
Those big live events when you were giving, 10-year scenarios, and here we are at, I think, almost at the end of the cycle. I think it was some remarkably accurate scenarios penned back there.
Yeah, if you go back on it, we started to understand in my former guise. I worked for the IRR, and we had a very good read on the relationship between socioeconomics, so living standards and people's standards of living, and the housing trends, job trends, income trends, and how that translated into political behavior. And we saw that in the first decade after 94, when things went relatively well, support for the ANC was rising. And we doubted at once the thesis that was then being thrown around about liberation loyalty voting, essentially that ANC voters don't think, they just vote for the ANC because that's all that they do. And we thought there was a much more reasoned, much more sensible, much more sort of fact-based basis to voter behavior in the country. And we surmised from that would socioeconomic circumstances ever turn, we would see a rapid erosion in support for South Africa's ruling party and a move towards the opposition, and by necessity coalition opposition politics, because we're a very diverse society. And we then added to that the read that the Mbeki administration would come to a grisly end, which it did, that it wasn't sustainable, and that it would be followed by an era of less than effective governance, which would see the reversal of socioeconomic trends. And that happened, and then we see the fall away in ANC voter support. And in 2012, I think in print, for the first time, we said that we think the ANC will lose a future election. And remember, at the time, ANC support's almost 70%. And that we thought that would happen in the 2024 national election, which is 1 year from today. Yeah. And we'll talk a bit as we go on through this chat about the current numbers and trends and what's likely to happen there.
Because, that is the point. The Social Research Foundation is a research foundation. You guys are literally gathering data all the time. You're not making this up. This isn't coming out of the head of Frans Cronje or a few people. This is based on actual research data.
Yeah, what happened behind the SRF is a number of individuals, and some particularly prominent ones, approached me and said, where to now for South Africa? The confidence in Mr. Ramaphosa was fading. This is all about 18 months, 2 years ago or so. What do we do next? There was this talk of these potential coalitions. And one of my answers was that no one really understands the society very well. They're myths about South Africa. They're myths about what motivates behavior in the country, including political behavior. And if you want to develop informed strategy, not just for yourselves, but broadly, and as a service to the society, there needs to be an organization that collects very high quality social and research and opinion research. And SRF was established in order to do that. It conducts, commissions a lot of polling work. It's done a lot of focus group work. It's trying to understand the motive forces behind voter behavior. What always comes back from that, regardless of what you see in the world around you, is that in the main, the voting public is reasonable and pragmatic and moderate in its opinions. And the political position within the country, whatever that is a product of reasonable and usually relatively well-informed voter behavior and opinion. And that data is made available now to various diplomats, to the leaders of political parties. It's made available to key business leaders. And we went through our first year. We're a pretty small-scale outfit. We didn't want to, seem, to say we're the greatest thing ever. And we didn't even have a website because we were very contained, producing information for a handful of people. We've changed that now. There is now a website, srfreports.co.za, and we put up the basic reports that we do on that website for anyone to read who's interested in them. And we possess a vast database of knowledge, literally hundreds of thousands of data points on the behavior of voters and what motivates voter behavior, and not just voter behavior, but human behavior broadly within the country. We've recently done a lot of work, for example, on protest action. Have you participated in protests? Will you in the future? Are you sympathetic to violent protests? Do you think the country is at risk of a repeat of what happened in Natal? Do you think a point is reached where the country might see violent insurrection? So all of that is available, and we supply that to any group who wishes to have a better understanding of what is happening in the society.
Okay, so before we sort of launch into some of the findings in your most, in your recent survey, let's just set a bit of a scene, because it's something that I hear a lot of, and I don't think it's correct. There's this kind of understanding that people are just going to blindly vote for the ANC when the facts tell you a different story. If you look at it, and to your point of the voters being a bit more nuanced than what they're given credit for, we're talking about voters that have literally, to the extent of more than 20%, moved away from the ANC. It's a significant move. So I think that to anybody out there that thinks that people just blindly step in and vote for the ANC, they're not concentrating and looking at the numbers. There's no country in the world where you go from 100 to 0. It just doesn't happen. And
Look, ANC voters are sensible, pragmatic and reasonable in their decisions, and their decisions have a logical basis and often a very factual basis. So, I mean, that if you get into political analysis or into futures work on South Africa with a different point of departure, I would think that that your point of departure is flawed and the conclusions you will reach are flawed. So you need to understand why ANC voters make the choices they do. You also need to understand that the country is changing very quickly. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the ANC had almost 70% of support in the 2004 national election, higher than what it had under Mandela in 1994. And that was a function of rapidly improved standards of living. And the ANC did much better in that era than any of its critics ever gave it credit for. We're now polling the ANC at nearer 50%. That's vastly down. So there is occasionally, you see it in what you might perhaps call elite society, this call that someone must do something. There must be a change movement. And I had a journalist this morning who got hold of me and said that, I think there could one day be a change movement should, civil society get together and do something. And my answer is you're missing it. It's there. It's the ANC has 50% of support today. It had 70% before. The change movement is very big. It is very alive. It has the support of millions of people. And the change movement isn't business doing something. It's not civil society doing something. They both do very good things. It's not politicians doing something. It's the rule. This is the rule of this stuff. There go the people, and as their leader, we will follow them. And that's what's happening in the society. And South Africa is changing rapidly, very quickly and significantly. And the trajectory of the change is actually quite encouraging if you understand the opinions behind it and the choices voters may begin to make in future.
So the lesson that comes out of this is when you go on to social media, don't make the comment, oh, but everybody's just going to vote for them anyway, because that...
Well, they're not going to vote for them. They don't.
They
I
don't.
mean,
Exactly.
the point is exactly that. That they're down to 50%. And beyond that, within the existing 50%, a third of that is ready to go. It's ready to leave and vote for the opposition. It hasn't done so yet. But in time, unless the ANC governs very much better, it will leave. And then ANC support falls to between 30 and 40%. and some sort of opposition getting together, we can talk a bit about that and the prospects for it, then has a shot at forming a national administration.
Yeah, so in a way, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts in a second, it's a lot more democratic, for example, than what happens in places like, for example, the USA, where you've got people that have voted for the Republican Party, regardless of the candidate is on either side of the election. They're lifers, they're members of the party, and about 45% of each poll is guaranteed. It's just that little swing vote that changes. In South Africa, almost every vote is up for grabs, and people are making those changes, except for the DA supporters.
I don't know if I'd say it's more democratic than what happens in the United States. Yeah. The circumstances are very different. Yeah. The socioeconomic pressures here are immense. Real per capita GDP has been falling now for the better part of a decade. There's been essentially zero net new job creation for 10 years. I mean, these are incredibly intense economic and social forces. And under that pressure, and as a consequence of it, human opinion, national opinion, popular opinion, and voter behavior is changing very quickly.
Okay, so the last time we spoke to you, it was towards the end of 2022. At that point, the ANC seemed to be on a downward slide, and it looked, to all intents and purposes, like they were going to poll below 50%. Yeah. But that fall may have been arrested. Tell us more about what the data says.
Look, we tested them in June last year in great detail. So that's a big sample by South African standards, about 3,500. Gives you a margin of error of 1.7%, which is low. And on that, on the raw data, we had the ANC just below 50% and sinking. And then you need to take the raw data and you need to model it for voter turnout. So you need to figure out who's actually going to go and vote. You can do that by a battery of questions you ask people. And on the turnout scenarios, the best we could do for the ANC on a really good day is get it to about 52%. We've done it again now at the end of March. It's a smaller sample size this time. It's 1,500. The reason is between our big samples, we every quarter test a small sample just to see, by South African standards, 1,500 is a very big sample, but by our standards, quite small. Just to see whether our macro big sample findings are still broadly where they should be. What that shows is that the decline in ANC support has probably been arrested. On the raw data, the ANC is still sub 50% and some way below it, but modelled for turnout, we can get the ANC now to 52, 53%. And our read from that stuff is, and there's a broader margin of error. It's a 4% margin of error on the national figures there, so you must keep that in mind. Our read from not a single number, but the battery of numbers that are obtained, and they stretch far beyond what we could possibly cover in a conversation like this, is that the decline in ANC support has slowed and been arrested, that the rise in broader opposition support has slowed and probably been arrested. And further, we tested this in great detail. If the ANC is able to reduce the extent of load shedding by the time of the 2024 election, and I think they will succeed in that, then ANC support, I would say to you, could in that election come in at over 55% of the vote. So the reports of its death have at this time been very much exaggerated, and the ANC is comfortably in the low 50s at this time. But it's a long time, a year to go still. These things can swing. And we understand what behaviors on the part of political leaders and what socio-economic trends will determine those swings. So we can predict this if you tell us what politicians will do, and you give us a good sense of what will happen in the country's economy, we can probably, with some precision, foretell what an election result is going to be.
No, it's a two-way street, because on the one hand you've got the ANC, and they're going to live and die by some of the socio-economic deliverables, if you want to call it that, from a state perspective, electricity and maybe transport and a few other issues. But there's also this terrible issue at the moment with our opposition parties that seem to be not helping their cause.
The two sides, exactly. Broadly, the two sides are, will the ANC do better and will the opposition do worse? And in the period between our June 2022 data and our March of this year, 2023 data, exactly that happened. The ANC did better in many respects, and off a low base, admittedly. We can talk a bit about that. And the opposition has not done well at all. Headed into 2022, really after the 2021 local government polls, the idea was created that there is a different kind of future for South Africa. It's one where a number of smaller parties with reasonable values, most people have reasonable values, get together and they agree on a common course of action. They remain independent of each other, common course of action. And they unite, and that will start in Gauteng. And they will take away the major cities from the ANC, and they will govern them better. And that will be a blueprint that will set them up for victory in the 2024 in the 2024 national election, which happens next year. Now that was the blueprint, and it got off to a very rocky start, and things got worse from there. And in Pretoria, let's take one example, the audit result in a city that the Democratic Alliance had a great degree of control of for a number of years was appalling. It was as bad as anything that you will get out of the worst-run hellhole municipality in the Eastern Cape. It was truly shocking. It was very, very bad. Also, stay with the Pretoria example. Opposition parties discovered essentially that there were power stations in Pretoria that the municipality controlled that didn't do anything. And this was absolute political gold dust. If the opposition had collectively taken those power stations and said, look what we found, and we're going to refurbish these, and they will start producing electricity again, and we will beat load shedding. The hardest political issue of the last 6 months has been that the electricity is off for half the day. If the opposition could say, look, where we are, we're going to put power stations back into operation, they will deliver power and we will begin to beat load shedding. The juxtaposition of that platform, think of it as a platform, against the severe failings of Eskom under Andre de Ruyter, would be sufficient it would accelerate greatly. I mean, you really can't overstate these things. The growth of the broader opposition and the descent of the ANC. But what happened in practice is opposition parties began to squabble with each other. And one lot accused the other lot of corruption around the processes that would be used to put out the tenders to consider putting these power stations back into operation. And the whole thing was wrecked, and the public very much discouraged. There was a very important example in Johannesburg where right at the beginning of the DA's control of that city in the form of the mayorship in Popelatse, there was an opportunity to appoint what by all accounts was a very capable city manager. And again, the internal squabbling amongst opposition parties led to a situation where that person could not be appointed in Johannesburg. Had that happened, I saw that as a watershed moment. Had that happened, had that appointment occurred, the effect would have been that Johannesburg would have seen, under the coalition and the leadership of Palatse, an accelerated upswing. And what that would have done, if you just take these two examples, the power stations in Pretoria and just the better governance in Johannesburg, fill a couple of holes, try and put solar up on the traffic lights so that they're on. I mean, you can't keep them on otherwise, but you don't control Eskom yet, so put solar panels on them. The effect of that and the idea of unity in the coalition would have told a vast share of the 2024 electorate that it is reasonably possible that these opposition parties working together can turn the country around. And what may have happened then, it's difficult to say, but I think of the vast data banks we built up of opinion and how people read that situation. I think the effect of that would have been that support for the ANC would now be closer to 40% as opposed to 50%. And I think support for the broader opposition would be reaching the kind of level where, with a few smaller partners and pulling one or two of the ANC's proxies across, it would have been in reach that an opposition coalition could have governed the country a year from now. What's encouraging about now, but what happened because of the squabbling is people were dissuaded. There's a very important group of ANC voters, about a third of the ANC voter base. So let's say the ANC is at 15, so a third of that, let's say that's 15% of the electorate that's going to vote. 15% of the electorate, a third of ANC voter base, which really would have no trouble at all in identifying with the values of the broader opposition camp. Now, the broader opposition camp, let's say that stretches from Inkatha, which is on the up, through the DA, through ASA, and into the ACDP and the Freedom Front, would have those values, those pretty common set of values.
Yes.
Not much between them. A third of the ANC voter base would have no problem identifying with those values. They just needed a real-life working example of how this can come together. Because it fell apart so spectacularly, and the internal squabbling got wholly out of hand, and et cetera, that 30% were dissuaded. And remember what was being asked of them. What was being asked of them was to break from the political party that they had been so deeply invested in the sense that it had liberated them from white oppression and brought about the first decade. So it was a big move to make for them. It was a very difficult bridge to cross. And they looked across that bridge, if you think of it that way, and they looked at the potential, and what they saw was the Pretoria audit result, the squabbling over the power stations, the inability to appoint a city manager, and then the collapse of the whole thing. So what has happened is that third of the ANC voter base, which if it departed gives you my ANC 30 to 40, has decided, you know what?
Yeah, we'll stay where we are.
Bloody hell.
Yeah.
These guys aren't better than our guys. And if they're not better than our guys, why are you going to move from what you know and experience and resent and are cross with? ANC voters aren't happy with the ANC. But are you going to dump what the familiar that you know, you hope maybe it gets a bit better, are you going to dump that for the unknown of the opposition with all the controversies around that? You're not going to do that. And that is why, now as we sit here, a year to go, the position is that ANC support, the descent has stabilized, I think, and the opposition's rise has slowed.
There is an element in South Africa about it can sometimes be worse for a party to have power with some of the dynamics we've got in the country. I feel as a Gauteng resident, as a Joburg person, whoever is in charge here comes out looking worse.
Yeah, if you fight with each other, then you will. So where the ANC and the EFF are now trying to govern Johannesburg through the person of the mayor of the party, Al Jamaa, it's very difficult to govern effectively because these are, have no doubt, serious rivals. I mean, Al Jamaa doesn't really count. It's an ANC proxy party. But the ANC and the EFF are very unsure of how to slot in together. Now, in Gauteng, the Premier of Gauteng, the ANC leader of Gauteng, Lesufi, is extremely keen on making a great deal with the EFF, making that the national deal, and leading essentially a very militant kind of African nationalist charge against, I suppose, liberal democracy and capitalism. But he's a bit out on a limb there, has support from Paul Mashile. But he's out on a limb. And what I would describe as the more level-headed of the ANC are terrified at what Mashile and Lesotho are up to.
Yeah.
And the reason they're terrified of it is this, that the ANC brand today is corruption and incompetence. We not make this up. You ask people, thousands of them, what do you think of the ANC? Its own supporters, they say it's corrupt and incompetent. Totally useless. The EFF brand is violence and anarchy. That's what it's identified as by voters. Right. So what the Lesotho Mashile plan is going to do, it's going to mesh a brand of incompetence and corruption with a brand of violence and anarchy. The consequence of that will be to so alienate the broader aspirant and established urban middle classes that the ANC will necessarily become a regional, rural political party centered in time around Mpumalanga, Northwest, Limpopo, maybe a little bit of the Free State, where it will, in the fullness of time, hold, if we remain a free society, which is a very important if, but the odds are we will. And the ANC then hosts its final conference kind of under a thorn tree in the sort of dusty scrublands along the Botswana border. And that's the end of the party. Now, the ANC's better informed thinkers, supporters, strategists, leaders, analysts realize that this EFF deal is terrifying. Likewise, there are leaders within the political opposition who realize that if you do want to bring a coalition government to power in the fullness of time, you need to leave the voting mind with no doubt at all that there was no alternative but to bring the opposition to power. And the fastest way to do that is to put the EFF and the ANC together and let them try and govern. Yeah. Because the consequences for confidence in the country, for whatever, will be so great that 5 years down the line, again, if we remain a free society, will be so significant that the collective support of those two will be so low that it couldn't possibly aspire to national government. And then you bring the coalition to power.
Yeah. Now, in your analysis, do you take into account by-elections?
Yeah, very useful
because
to read.
Obviously, it seems like a useful tool. And the by-elections we've had since our local government elections in 2021 is disastrous for the EFF and the ANC.
In our latest March numbers, we do see a tailing off in EFF support, quite a significant one. In fact, on the actual numbers, it's so great, the fall off, that I find it hard to believe and think that some of it must be a question of margin of error. But have no doubt at all, EFF support is significantly down. And that makes sense because the voting public, I've said, choose reasonable, is moderate and sensible in its opinions. The EFF brand is violence and anarchy. There is not much support for that. So, again, I won't say who, but hell, some better ANC thinkers, when they think that how is it possible that some of our leaders, let alone in a place like Gauteng, can think this is the future for us. We'll take the history of Africa's grandest liberation movement, Tambo Latuli Mandela, and we'll hand it over to the EFF. I mean, they think this is horrific.
I recently had Prince Mashile on here, and I would urge anybody to watch that interview. And we definitely in that discussion we agreed that it's absolutely clear that Mashile's role is to try and get rid of Cyril Ramaphosa so that he can bring in Julius Malema and run on that sort of joint ticket. It seems as obvious as clear as that.
Mashile, I agree with what Mashile said to you on that interview. I think he's spot on.
Yeah. So,
with what Mashile said, that was a very good interview that you did, a very important one, and you're right. If you haven't watched that one, that's one to go and have a look at, because it got very much closer to the thing than is true for much of the country's political opinion circuit.
So the picture starts getting quite cloudy if one looks towards the next election. And we understand you're basing it on research and numbers, but there's many factors that are going to play into this. I mean, for example, we do have complete and utter Stockholm syndrome now with regards to electricity. We do. I have to agree with the chairman of Eskom. We feel like cheering when it's stage 2, which is a ridiculous state of mind, right? But it does work. When you deprive people of something like electricity for long enough, we get happy when we see it stage 2.
Okay. Now, I'll say something to you that's peculiar.
Yes.
It's pretty easy to get out of load shedding.
Right.
Think about it. I'll try and make it simple. Think about it this way. The country, and chiefly Eskom, possesses about 50,000 megawatts of potential electricity that it could produce if all the things that produced electricity did produce electricity at once.
Yes.
Which won't happen.
Yeah.
Some of them very old and broken and so on. Through February, which is when this analysis was done, of that 50,000, about 24,000 worked and produced electricity, 24,000 megawatts in the peak hour of a day on average. Right. Now, of that 50, about 40 something, let's say 45 is coal. But coal, through that same February period when we were producing 24,000, was contributing 15, 16, 17,000. So only a third of the coal fleet is essentially contributing electricity to the grid. So you'll say, well, what's the other stuff? Well, let's say there was 17,000 from coal. We import 1 or 2,000. So let's say that gets us to 19, and we've got about 1 or 2 of solar, so that gets us to 21, and we import 1, and then we've got water storage and hydro, and we've got the gas turbines, which burn diesel in South Africa's case, and they contribute 1 or 2. And the nuclear power station at Kuba can produce 2, but was producing 1 because it was being refurbished. If you do the following, so we were then at stage 4 load shedding, let's say on average, producing 24,000 megawatts. And each stage of load shedding is 1,000 megawatts. So if we were producing 28,000 megawatts, and for the energy people watching this, I know this is a simplified analysis. We were producing 24. Stage 4 load shedding means if we were producing 28, we wouldn't have load shedding.
Yeah.
So we're short of 4.
Yeah.
But remember, we've got about 25 that doesn't work. Let's eliminate the 4 stages of load shedding. And I know that there are many other ways of doing it, other than the ones I'm sharing with Michael here today.
Yeah, sure.
So you buy enough diesel to run the gas turbines all the time, or a lot of the time. That will take out 1 to 2 stages of load shedding, just like that. You finish the refurbishment of Kuberg, that will happen. That takes out another stage. You get to the point where we will be by the end of this year, where rooftop installation of solar will be contributing a further 1 or 2. And just on that, load shedding starts to disappear. But the real promise lies in the refurbishment of the coal infrastructure. Now, I spoke to a lot of people who know about coal and how it works here and how it was put together. And they're broadly unanimous in that it's possible to take our non-productive coal infrastructure and audit it. And that audit involves looking at the station and its boilers and sort of going in and saying, well, what's broken? Does the valve work? Or do the pipes have holes in them? That sort of thing. And a team of engineers would say, yes, these are the problems. And then it's as simple, I'm told, as you order the parts you need from either the original equipment manufacturer or from, if they don't exist, some of the stuff's very old, from someone else to make it. And you install the bits that you need to install, and you get rid of the trucking of coal, which is a corrupt enterprise. And on a time frame of 3 years, it's possible to put about 10,000 megawatts of coal back into production. So not just can you close the load shedding gap in a short period of time, but you can actually put South Africa in a position where, from an energy perspective, very much higher rates of economic growth are possible. Now, this is all fairly well understood in parts of the government and the ANC, and the realization is there that if they solely pursue green energy options at this time, they can run into the election with the lights off. If they work towards buying enough diesel and the refurbishment of coal, they can get into a position where they solve load shedding. Now, you said a very interesting thing, because you said people celebrate at stage 2, and they do, and that's the Stockholm syndrome, and it's a function not just of that, but of the point I made to you earlier, that ANC voters look at the opposition and they see this pathetic infighting and squabbling, and they say, well, hell no, I'm sticking where I am. If where I am then turns the lights on before the election, that's how you get back to what I told you of an ANC that's not dead, but has support levels back in the 50s. Now, if that happens, let's just go one step over. Is that a terrible result? Does that mean the society is failing further or faster than before? It doesn't mean that. It means we're not going to be successful. ANC's got to introduce a vast swathe of policy reforms to actually get real growth and job creation. And it's not going to do any of those reforms. But it does mean that the ANC got back in power again because on the question of electricity it governed a bit better. And it shows how the system works, that the relative balance between what the squabbling coalition offered, what the ANC offered, tilted in favour of the ANC, and it was given another term of 5 years in government.
Okay, so I want to put two questions to you, and I'm not sure if your research even tells you this or whether it's your own sort of opinion. One is that on the issue of economic growth and doing what would sort of turn the corner of South Africa, sort of heading headlong down to sort of failed statehood and perhaps turning it around, do you think that the ANC wants that?
Yes, it wants that.
Hang on a second, slowly, because, I mean, at the moment, all our president can do is trumpet social grants. And there is no doubt those social grants, and we had Songezo Zibi here and Misi Maimani waxing lyrical about social grants, right? Because they look at poor people and they're saying, well, look, this is the difference between them starving or not. Yeah. And they're going to vote for the ANC every time they get the social grants. Similarly, education, you keep the system bad, people aren't going to become clever blacks and start looking around. Yes. So have we not got into the situation where the ANC has become incentivized to torpedo the country for its own aims, much like ZANU did in Zim?
I disagree with that. The ANC wants the results you speak of.
What, the bigger social grants, or?
Well, higher growth, higher revenues, the ability to pay more grants. What informs
that statement? Because to be fair, there's no in the past 10 years, there's not one action.
My direct experience.
Right.
The ANC wants, I'm going to get to your point. Mm-hmm. It wants the results you speak of. It understands that we are an urbanizing, middle class, increasingly aspirant middle class society, and that scorched earth style policies will, if we remain a free society, and you must interrogate me on that point before we end today, because it's very important, if we remain a free society means the ANC loses. It understands that its best era was when the economy was growing and jobs were being, in its first decade it doubled the number of people in employment. It hasn't created any jobs for 10 years, give or take. It understands this and it wants your results, yes. And this is a very important point to get to, because my experience of Western diplomats or often people in business is they think that what I just told them is the ANC is going to introduce reforms, and it's not. It's not prepared to bring about the policy shifts that are necessary to make the results possible, even as it desires the results. And the reasons for that are a myriad of things. The first one is very practical. The ANC finds it difficult to take firm, pragmatic decisions because its structure is wrong. The National Executive Committee of the ANC, which is its board, has 80 ordinary members, drawn from a host of different backgrounds, literally half of whom are vulnerable to prosecution and imprisonment for corruption. A useful chunk of whom are dogmatic ideologues, and others who loathe each other. So this collection of 80 individuals, plus individuals, must make firm decisions on labour market reform. It's impossible. So structurally the ANC can't make the decisions that it needs to make. That's one reason. Second reason why the ANC won't introduce reforms is there's an ideological hostility to reform. Now, I said to you that Western diplomats fail to understand this, and business people here find it very difficult to understand, which is why they're always surprised on the downside by the ANC, because the ANC says in a meeting, yes, we need more, terrifying, the unemployment, the deficit, all of this, and they think, oh, well, these guys are going to reform. They're not. My experience of Asian, so Russian, Chinese, although not recently, but a few years ago, diplomats, is that they understood this instinctively, because they understand the power, the influence that a leftist ideological grip can have on a political organization. And that is underestimated by business leaders. It's not understood by Western diplomats. And so they struggle to get the ANC right. So that's the second reason why it won't do it. The third reason why the ANC won't govern better is that a significant share of its leaders are vulnerable to prosecution if the country is one day well governed. Because you're unlikely to have a country that's a high growth, free and open entrepreneurial society that doesn't also have highly effective law enforcement agencies. And if you create highly effective and independent law enforcement agencies and you become that kind of country, the state capture suspects of the past 20 years, remember it's not a 10-year project, will eventually have their comeuppance. And they are afraid of going to jail. And therefore they cannot afford to allow the country to be better run. Okay. So that's why I preempted your question. It wants the results,
yes,
but it will not introduce the policies to achieve the results. It's
like the person who wants to lose weight, but they won't go to gym, that kind of situation. Or they know what to do, but they won't do it.
Yes. Oh, yes, the ANC, must be no doubt at all. The ANC knows what to do.
So, which brings us to the big question. Does South Africa remain a free society?
Well, this is the critical thing, you see. If the ANC gets 55% in the next election, it essentially remains a free society. Particularly if our very effective civil society organs and actors are well resourced. They will be able to head off the worst of the autocratic inclinations of the ANC, and will remain an essentially free and open society. We are a free and open society. People tend to think when they look at the parlous state of the country that this is perhaps the worst thing that could ever happen to you, and our odds of success are overwhelmingly poor, but they're not. They're pretty good, in fact, because you can be critical of the government, you can lobby against it, you can support an opposition party, in which we've been very generous towards the ruling administration, admittedly. But we can do all of that. And you don't get dragged away by the secret police in the middle of the night. Now, this year, the Venezuelans have again arrested the opposition. What I've said through this year to often dismayed sort of business types who say there's no hope, everyone will have to leave, it's a catastrophe. I've said a real catastrophe would be if you asked me, how do we get John Steenhuisen out of jail? Or Herman Mashile, who's in the torture chambers under the union buildings. Right. That's a big problem. And an equally big problem is how your association, in trying to get them out, gets you and your family locked up and your business confiscated. These are serious problems. The problems we have are less serious than that, and therefore perfectly something that we can overcome. So I think if the ANC is at 55, we remain an essentially free society and we can carry on working towards a solution. Don't also be too, now that we're being nice about the ANC, don't also be too critical. Fiscally, it's pragmatic. It always was after the release of Mandela. And 13 years into government, the ANC recorded a budget surplus that coincided with having cut national debt to GDP numbers in half. Through the decade from 28 to the sort of end of Mr. Zuma, the left-wing influence in the ANC borrowed very heavily and debt levels escalated. But the current finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, is being very pragmatic and is seeking to achieve primary budget surplus, which is a remarkable thing. And his debt projections and forecasts and so on are positive. And I'll say be grateful for that.
Mm.
If the ANC wanted to wreck the country and go autocratic, what it would do is create inflation by printing money. Not in order to have money, because you don't have money if you print money, but to create inflation in order to create desperation in poor communities. Because desperation is the fuel of populism. And so by printing large amounts of money, the ANC could turn the country populist and evade the risks of losing an election. They're not printing money, and they're being eminently sensible in the country's finances. Now, my critics, when I make this point, say to me, but Mr. Godongwana hasn't introduced any reforms. And I said, and my answer is, it's very difficult for him to do so, even if he was inclined to do so. But he is, with the hand he has been dealt, which is appalling, government policy, completely inimical to any investment or growth or confidence, he's doing a very good job. So if the ANC wins, the fiscal prudence and the Mashile Lusufi mad hatter scheme doesn't take off, then you probably get us bouncing along the bottom as we have been. And just on a third point, on electricity, for example, the ANC allows private actors to get on and do what they can to limit the consequences of the government's failures. That is, again, a better position. I'm not saying we're in a good position. I know the kinds of messages I get after an interview like this. I'm not saying things are going well. I'm just trying to say within the sort of position we find ourselves in, we've not reached the end of the road. The precipice isn't right here. It's not far away, but it's not right here either. And that's very different to many other societies where an autocratic state might tell the private sector you may not introduce your own solutions to energy because it is a national security issue and the state will handle it. We're not there at this time. So let's say we get Mashile and Lusufi's Mad Hatter scheme and a great deal is done with the EFF. That will lead almost immediately to an assault on the constitutional edifice and the rule of law. So freedom of speech, the free media, the free press, civil society organizations, restrictions on political activity, a further securitization of the state, most probably the abandonment of fiscal prudence and discipline. Confidence will fall through the floor. The currency will do a run, a proper run. Yeah.
When you need another space for another.
The currency will do a proper run.
Yeah.
That's a very, very dangerous moment.
Yes.
Because if that assault succeeds,
Yes.
it means that we are no longer a free society, which means that we cannot rely again on what I have described to you as the pragmatism and reasonableness of the voting public. That option is removed. And then, yes, the country's a write-off for a number of decades, and it's not the sort of place that retains middle class. Property rights gone, etc. However, the ANC EFF collective will have 5 years to pull off this result. It's not a very long period of time, considering that the two sides loathe each other deeply and the ANC is deeply divided on whether to do this at all. If civil society is extremely well resourced, in other words, that people with means and companies with means give it a lot of money, it will be possible, I think, on the balance of probabilities, for a heroic civil society action, the same kind of action that helped us deal with state capture, but just on a supersized scale, to checkmate every effort of that EFF ANC administration to undermine property rights, the rule of law, freedom of speech, political association, everything that goes with that, and fiscal pragmatism. And if they succeed in holding that line, and we go in 2029 then to another free election, then the odds are that the ANC EFF collective is extremely low. And that at least that third and others of the current ANC base that's ready to leave will have left. And we will have a pragmatic coalition offering. And a point before we started that we discussed is, you've had a few of these young political entrepreneurs, let's call them that, through the studio of yours. And some will be successful and some won't. I think what all of them do is great. I mean, it's a terrible life.
Yeah.
And that they do it at all, I mean, we can be critical of them, but the whole opposition, even the ones that squabble with each other, it is pathetic. But, it's pretty great what they do. And they don't have to do it. All those political entrepreneurs and the current opposition lineup are broadly sensible and pragmatic. They agree that markets generally do better than the state in determining successful economic outcomes. They broadly agree that people should be free to say and think what they do, whatever they feel, within reason and limits. And just on those 2 points again, we're fortunate as a country that this is our opposition and our growing opposition, not a crowd of crazed racial nationalist Marxist extremists who are threatening to come to power. Because if that was our opposition, we would again be in a very much more difficult position than the one we're in at the moment.
Frans, just just as a thought, is there a chance, in your opinion, that if the Mashile, Malema, Lesotho plan is hatched before the 2024 election, because they've got a wonderful opportunity? Cyril Ramaphosa's got a genuine case to answer with Phala Phala. They see a chance to move against the guy. They see a chance to get rid of him, right? And it gets hatched. Is there a chance of a proper split in the ANC, which, the cope option, but done without Monsieur Lokota, but hopefully somebody with a little bit more sort of national interest at heart?
Yes, there is a chance of that. It's obviously a delicate situation, but there is a chance of that. The ANC universe, there's the ANC itself, the party, Luthuli House, and then there's the union buildings and the little circle around that. But there's a much broader universe around the ANC of individuals who firstly dedicated a lot of their youth to fighting apartheid. And that was a hell of a thing to do if you think of what that took. They didn't know how it would end, etc. And secondly, we're part of the first decade after 94, which records a budget surplus. Fiscal prudence of spectacular success.
And
doubles the number of people with jobs, gets growth up. Of course, lots of mistakes. The racialization of the civil service, which was the key to its demise. Well, near demise. I was going to say collapse, but not quite there. We're close to that. The failures on Eskom, the precedent set on the arms deal, the diplomacy on Zimbabwe, all of these things were there too, but there were other things.
The killing of 500,000 South Africans.
Yeah, 500. Yeah, 500,000 people have been murdered since 1994. There are two of those numbers. One is rampant violent crime, which leaves us in a book I wrote a few years ago. We were trying to explain the seriousness of the violent crime position. And so we started drawing comparisons on our murder rate to war-related deaths. So this would be conflict, not related deaths in the Middle East. And we were able to draw comparisons. They're not perfect, but they're not far away. Conflict-related deaths in the Middle East over a period of 25 years on a per capita basis, competitive with murder rate here. That's a hell of a number to think of. So obviously those are there, but I'm trying, for the purposes of our discussion today, to think towards the future and what ingredients we possess within the country that, if we bring them together in a sensible formulation, allow us to get out of the mess that we're in now. So what are those? We've got pragmatism of people. All our young political entrepreneurs, who some will be successful and some won't, are essentially sensible in how they want to do things. We remain a fundamentally free and open society. Even the ruling party, in its final throes, has the ability now to get a workable plan together on Eskom's, fiscally pragmatic, and isn't taking a serious run at this time against civil liberties and the rule of law. And in that broader universe, which is how we got to this part of the conversation, that broader universe around the ANC are people who dedicate a lot of their lives to fighting for democracy and then came to government and actually did pretty well in the economy, in a relative sense, certainly compared to what came after them, in a relative sense. And these are our assets as a society. They aren't going to disappear after the 2024 election. And if we can assemble them in a sensible way, they make it likely, if you assemble them in a sensible way. If you squander them, of course, something else happens. If you assemble them in a sensible way, they make it likely that South Africa sees a strong recovery trend line, curve, through the 2030s and into the 2040s.
That sounds like the country's moonshot there, Frans.
Yeah, well, it does a bit, doesn't it? Yes.
Frans Cronje, thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. To everybody that's joined us, I hope you've enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the State of the Nation channel, and please join us for our next enthralling interview. Frans Cronje, thank you once again. It's been fantastic.
Mike, thank you.
George, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.